Hello.
You're looking very sunny today.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm trying to
Match.
bring.
See, I see. I always, and I swear I don't do this consciously, but
Yeah.
every time I meet you, I try to match the book that you're releasing. So I went, I went gold and black and white for Double or Nothing's launch
Yes.
back here, and now I've gone for green. There you go. And I've got two copies of the book we're talking about today. I know you sent me this months before the book was published, but it did the rounds through Royal Mail and didn't actually arrive for months later. But the proof version. So you match the proof, or right?
Yes.
Well, I'm kind of matching both.
This is good. We need to do
I
like a
know. I'm
fashion show.
like, I'm never not color coordinated. Let's put it that way.
Oh,
So,
that's such a good motto.
exactly. So today, I know we'll end up talking about James Bond at some point because we always end up doing, even when we don't set out to talk about James Bond. But we are talking, for the most part, around A Wild and True Relation. Which, if people have, when was it? It was released while I was
It came
taking a
out in February.
trip to Japan, wasn't it? So
Yeah.
I actually messaged you as soon as I landed, and because I'd read the first half, and I was just like, I've just read the first half of your book on my Kindle on the way back from Japan. Yeah, see, it was released while I was away there, and I did race through the first half. I mean, it's a long flight back from Tokyo, but I raced through the first half on that flight, and then raced through the second half when I came back. So, which is, I'm not bragging here or anything, but it is a pretty chunky book.
Yeah, that is impressive. It's a lot of
It's,
work in
it's
that
an
book.
epic. Yeah, 500 plus pages. So yeah, it's been out a few months now. So if people haven't read A Wild and True Relation, I urge you to read this book. Because I think it's fairly safe to say we're not going to spoil the ending or anything, but we will talk a lot about this book and its characters and things. So if you want to go in completely innocent and fresh, then pick it up, read it, and perhaps come back to it. Or this might whet your appetite to actually read it. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm aware that we're recording this and this will also go out during Pride Month. So it's June, and we were actually having a chat the other day, weren't we, about the extent to which, in fact, you messaged me and said, "Is this a queer book?" And I think my response was, in capital letters, "It is awesomely queer." Something along those lines. So yeah, I'm interested to talk about that, and I know that you're interested to kind of talk about things that you haven't had a chance to talk about in some of the other interviews around this book, including some of the personal qualities to it. So that's really exciting. I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into it. So let's start. I mean, let's start with the queer thing, because why did I think this was awesomely queer? Because it is. I mean, you've actually got some queer characters in here. Well, LGBTQ identifying. Okay, just to back up for a sec, most of the terms that we use today, like lesbian, gay, bisexual, most of those terms have been around for only around 100, 150 years, even like homosexual, heterosexual. But you have characters who are in same-sex relationships, and you also have several characters who they don't subscribe to the gender binary.
Mm.
So, but as I think, and it's brilliant that your book and it does this. It kind of makes people aware that people like that have always existed, which
Mm.
is often a misconception. So, what kind of inspired you to? I mean, do you want to talk about those particular characters and why you put, like, Nathan? Love Nathan. Why do you have those characters in your book?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's really interesting when I messaged you and said, would you consider this a queer book?
Mm,
I was thinking a lot about the almost the labels that become attached to a book after you publish it, because Virago, my publisher, including A Wild and True Relation in their Pride celebrations, which I am very proud of. But it's funny, when you're writing something, you're not kind of thinking about the labels it fits under. You're
yeah.
writing from a very organic, subconscious place, and then it goes out in the world, and you see how other people receive it, and that's part of the really exciting thing about bringing a book out, because it becomes not just yours, it becomes part of other people's lives. But for me, it's been a very big part of my life. I've been writing it for 14 years now, on and off. Obviously, some other things happened in between, including James Bond. It was supposed to be my first novel, and life took a few unexpected turns. And it did come from quite a personal place, really. So it's for those who haven't had a chance to read it yet or read about it, it's set in the early 18th century. It opens on the night of the Great Storm in Devon in 1703, with smuggling captain Tom West coming ashore in a rage because he believes his lover Grace has betrayed him to the revenue. And following a confrontation, she is left dead. That's the first chapter, so it's not too much of a spoiler. And he takes her daughter Molly to raise as a boy aboard his ship under the name Orlando. And we have that main adventure of Molly growing up and discovering the truth of her origins. And then we have these interleaving sections with real life historical figures like Charles Dickens and George Eliot, Hester Thrale and Dr. Johnson, who come together to solve the mystery of Molly's life over the centuries. And it came to me actually on a Devon beach, the beach that it opens on. I was walking along and I saw this boathouse and I began to think of this idea of this smuggler. And I initially wrote the first chapter as a short story, entirely in 18th century Devonshire dialect, which nobody understood, unsurprisingly. So I rewrote it in modern English and then kept going and kept following the story. And a lot of the ideas in it, and you were talking about characters who don't subscribe to sort of gender binaries, like Molly, who's raised as a boy and lives as Orlando and Molly. And then, of course, characters like Nathan, who's having to hide his sexuality on the ship. A lot of that came from my childhood, I suppose, growing up as what was then called a tomboy, which, probably we would use different words today. But I've always had short hair and I've always loved things that weren't considered appropriate for girls. So James Bond, superheroes, football, and I had my hair short. I had my head shaved at one point, actually, when I was my mom was very, very nice, and I came home with a bit of a shock, shaved my head. She
Just
said,
imagine Ellie's reaction. Well, yeah. Actually, having got to know your mom a bit, I think she'd have probably been cool with it, was she?
She was very cool. Yeah, she was like, "That's what you want? That's fine." A lot of people did come up to her and say, "I'm so sorry about your child," because they thought I had leukemia or something, and she'd say, "No, she just wanted a shaved head."
What led to the shaved head? Did you just decide one day, I want to see what I look like with no hair?
Yeah, well, I was quite punky in primary school. I had a Sid Vicious phase, and I would always wear what would be considered then as boys' clothes. I mean, all of these ideas are so ridiculous. What I was wearing was an Arsenal top and jeans. Why should that be considered boys' clothes? But it was, and people would perceive me as a boy. So that was something that's really fed into this book, that for a lot of my childhood years, people who met me would think I was a boy and treat me as a boy. And so I had this sort of funny experience of learning what it was like to be a boy in the world and to be treated as a boy, and then learning what it was like when people realized that I was a girl. And suddenly well, then you shouldn't be playing football, or well, then why do you like action figurines so much, or that suddenly that shift. So I think that it kind of taught me a lot about how people perceive and police gender, and how much it's constructed by society rather than something that's sort of natural. If you see what I mean.
As you were talking, it made me think of I can't remember the name of it. There was a famous experiment where they some researchers tested this out by allowing babies to climb slopes. Okay. As you do. And what they did is they had to give them an activity to do where there was kind of a slight element of risk involved. So climbing a slope was about as risky as I think the ethics would allow that particular experiment. And they let these babies climb the slopes, and then they had these onlookers. I think they were people who were parents themselves, but they weren't obviously their children. And then they were like playing with the kids, and then letting the babies climb these slopes, ever increasing the height of these slopes. But then it's a weird experiment, I know. But essentially, what happened then is they didn't tell any of the adults involved whether the kids were boys or girls. As soon as they told the adults involved that which children were girls, they were like, "Oh no, let's reduce the level of the slope, the incline, because it's too risky for a girl to do. They're not strong enough to do it." Whereas the boys, they were like, "Yeah, come on, get moving."
Exactly,
That's a very crude encapsulation of what I'm sure was a very reliable study. But that I always have that in my head when I'm thinking about. I'll be honest. We've got 3 cats. and two of them are boys and one's a girl, and I have to sometimes fight. Even I have to fight sometimes, thinking the girl won't be able to hold her own in a fight, in a scrap.
Mm.
I mean, she
Mm.
does. She's a born fighter. She will pace her brothers. You know, if they try anything, she gives way more than she gets.
Yeah.
But there is part of me, unlike with the boys, I'm just thinking, oh, you know, they might get hurt. With her, I'm just like, oh, she might get hurt. So it is
Yeah.
something that's kind of, we're socially conditioned, aren't we?
Exactly. And I think for me as a kid, it was very obvious, that social conditioning, because I would experience it on both sides, and I would experience the change people underwent when they realized I was a girl, but also the sheer disbelief. Amazing how many people didn't believe I was a girl. I would have, so I went to a girls' school, secondary school. I would have supply teachers try and force me to leave the school because they thought I was a boy from the boys' school next door, and that this was a prank.
Oh my
And
Lord.
I was like playing a joke. And it didn't matter how much I said or my friends said, she's a girl. She just has short hair. But they just wouldn't believe me. And that kind of thing happened all the time to me as a kid, because people couldn't see past, but you have short hair and you're dressing in what I perceive to be boys' clothes. And so that, and, you know, certain sort of amount of bullying and things went along with that too. But just that kind of experience of, I suppose, being different in some way, or people treating me as if I was different. I think a lot of that fed into the writing of Molly and her experience of almost performing gender,
Yes.
obviously transposed into the 18th century.
But people have been performing, you know, that term I believe originated with Judith Butler, the idea of gender performativity, the whole idea that all of gender is a performance. But people will have been performing gender a long time before, you know, for thousands of years before that term even came into being. And I think that's why I replied to your message saying it's awesomely queer, because yes, you do have a few people who are same-sex attracted, and even with the kind of main character, there's some ambiguity around sexual orientation as well, which I found really enjoyable, as well as having two explicitly what we'd nowadays call gay characters. But it was that very, and I find this in all of your books, you know, including your Bond book, including Testament, there is that questioning of a lot of, you know, a lot of established dogma ideas and all that stuff, full stop, but particularly around gender. So now that you've shared that, I kind of understand where that comes from. I suppose in a sense, it was, go back to my earlier question, it's kind of like you didn't try to put that in the book. The challenge would have probably to keep that out of the book.
Yes, absolutely. And it's funny, those moments where you draw from real life without necessarily, a lot of writing is so unconscious, and you I think as a writer you have an internal question that needs to be answered, and it's a compulsion to answer it, and the book helps you answer it. But for a long time during the writing process, you couldn't tell people necessarily, this is the question I'm asking myself and this is how I'm answering it. But you will draw on your own life experiences. And I remember with Testament, actually, there's one element of the book where my editor said about one of the characters' relationships, relationship dynamic with their family. My editor said, this is just a bit unrealistic. I can't really see this happening in a family. It's just not very believable. I remember laughing and being like, that's the one bit that's true. You know.
Wow.
So there's those things that you write from, and you're kind of exorcising onto the page. And I think certainly with Molly's character in particular, a lot of those experiences that I had as a kid went into shaping the journey that she goes on through the book around trying to have ownership over her identity and her future, because she's been, through Tom taking her onto the ship and disguising her as a boy, she's suddenly got these much broader horizons, and she really worships Tom, and she looks up to him and thinks, you know, maybe one day I can have a ship of my own, and I could have this power that he has. But it's on a knife's edge, because as soon as she hits puberty, or as soon as somebody discovers what sort of deception has been practiced, she'll be forced back into a woman's life and out of this power that she's been given to taste. So there's a real kind of internal and external battle for Molly's future going on through the novel.
I think that fear of discovery is what propelled me so quickly through the book, to be honest, and probably one of the elements that resonated most with me. So I've never lived on a ship in the 18th century, but obviously I did spend a large proportion of my life kind of thinking, oh God, at some point, I'm going to have to kind of grow up, and that means, in fact, since I didn't even want to grow up in a sense, because it would kind of end up, I would have to kind of force the choice. Well, not even a choice, but I'd have to kind of tell people who I was, sort of thing, or through life being really, really miserable, which I think deep down I thought I wasn't going to let myself do that. But it's like, at what point do you decide enough's enough? And I think waiting, that's where a lot of the suspense of Wild and True comes from, for me. I don't know if you've heard that from any other readers.
No, that's really interesting. I haven't actually put that way, but I think it makes total sense. And that idea of one's identity almost being a ticking time bomb, but not through our own making, but because of social and cultural pressures. And that sense of, if I show people who I really am, will I be destroyed for it? Or will I be accepted? Or will I be able to create a new world in which I am accepted? All of those questions swirl around Molly through the book.
Yeah, I totally get that. Talking about what you're saying about gender performativity, there are elements of your book, and not just this book, but your other books, which, if one were of an ignorant frame of mind, might, and I know that you faced a little bit of this when you took on the Bond gig initially. It's like, a woman. I can't help but do the Roger Moore in Moonraker voice again. A woman. But this is a book written by a woman, and and you've got elements in there which some people might kind of find surprising, again, if they've not read many books written by women in recent years, because I can think of other women who pepper their books with some. Well, I wrote it down in my notes as very salty language. Because there's that social convention of women don't use that kind of language. But I think it stood out for me, particularly in your book, because it is period set. But of course, people have been using salty language. The C word goes back 800 years. The F word goes back even longer. These words have been around, but because I think probably, again, we've been conditioned perhaps by cinema more than anything, which has always been rather censorious about swearing, and literature as well. I think we forget that people turn the air blue for as long as human beings have been around.
Absolutely.
So did you delight in putting some of that salty language in the book?
Yeah, very much so. My agent's assistant, so when people are becoming agents, first of all, they're an assistant, and they kind of have a go at editing your book for their own training almost. And so she sent me her notes, which were really lovely. And the top note was, I think there's more literary dick jokes in this book than you've ever encountered. I was very proud of. But certainly, it's a community of smugglers in the 18th century. They're not going to be prurient. And I had a lot of fun researching swear words and curses from the time, which were a lot more religious. So a lot of kind of God's teeth, God's eyes, God's blood, all of those things, which I enjoyed peppering throughout.
That's the one I always have to explain to students if I've taught Shakespeare. It's blood. It's like God's blood. So why is that a swear word? Because people are religious. Yeah, exactly.
And I collect dictionaries, and had a lot of fun going back through Dr. Johnson's dictionary and picking through word meanings from that time, and actually the word adventure, which really sits at the heart of this novel, because it is a kind of take on the 18th century adventure novel. In this era, if you asked a man about his adventures, tell me about your adventures, it would mean tell me about your travels, or tell me about the things you've hazarded or risked. If you said to a woman, tell me about your adventures,
I'm guessing already what this might mean.
You were asking, tell me about your exploits in bed.
Yes,
that was all it meant. And so it was a terrible insult. And a lady of adventure was a prostitute. So you can really see the gender lines, and that's something that I was really interested in getting into with the novel, especially in the interleaving sections where I have these real life historical writers, kind of having these conversations and debates around genre and gender. And Robert Louis Stevenson is a great example, because he in some ways invented the adventure novel as we see it now, the sort of Treasure Island kidnapped kind of story. And he came up with the story of Treasure Island on a very rainy Scottish holiday with his stepson. He needed to entertain his stepson, so he came up with this story, and they came up with some rules together. And the rules were that it was a boys' story, and that women were to be excluded. So you can really see there in this, his writing and his success and the Victorian magazine craze aimed at newly literate boys. You can see how this idea of policing gender and a gender division has always existed in the idea of the adventure, the quest, who gets to go on the journey.
I always hated the term boys' own adventure.
Me too.
I do wonder, now you've said that, I didn't realise that Stevenson was quite, because both you and I are Stevenson admirers.
Yes.
And when I popped up to Edinburgh for the launch of this book, funnily enough, I enjoyed going to the Robert Louis Stevenson Museum, but I didn't realise that he was, that he kind of codified what adventure meant, and that there was that gender dimension baked into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that sort of craze of publishing for boys around that time, it still stays with us. Part of the inspiration for this book was when Penguin reissued a very sumptuously beautiful series of classic adventure stories, and they did new illustrated covers, but they labeled it Boys' Own Stories. And this was in 2008, I think it was. And I just remember being so annoyed, because feeling like, well, I love these books, and it's Arthur Conan Doyle and Robert Louis Stevenson and John Buchan, and why? I understand in the Victorian era, I understand the context of where that came from, but do we have to hold on to it in the 21st century? And also, I think it was a series of 10 or 11 books, all male writers, all male heroes. And so partly with the Wild and True Relation, I wanted to say, well, what other heroes are there? How can we tell stories of difference and celebrate life that's been kept to the margins in literary history?
No, I'm racking my brains actually, trying to think of an adventure story series which is well known, which has, I'm sure there will be loads out there, I know, but which has that kind of same kind of cachet as Stevenson and so forth, that has a woman at the center of it. And
it's not as you do really see the gender divide. You have to think a little bit harder. So you've obviously got Daphne du Maurier, you've got Frenchman's Creek, you've got her amazing books, Georgette Hare, but often people will see that more as romance. And I often think about Enid Blyton. I know that Famous Five, there's a lot of things in the Famous Five that reflect the narrow-minded views of its time. But George was a revolutionary character, and remains so for me. When I was growing up, there were no other girls with short hair with islands battling smugglers to read about apart from George. That was it.
The one that sprang to mind for me is and I enjoyed the Famous Five books as well, and I know we talked about this when we talked about Bond, about which ones we identify with, and it definitely wasn't Julian or Dick in my case. But the one that I just thought of was Agatha Christie, and everyone thinks of Miss Marple, an older woman, but she's still having adventures, traveling the world, and also, and it's just gone out of my head, but she did 5 books, Tommy and Tuppence. I don't know if you've ever read those.
The N or M, her sort of spy novel, as it were. Yeah,
she's but Tuppence, the woman in that dynamic, and the books follow them through from their, I think, early 20s until they actually get married and grow into middle age. Tuppence is always the more active one. She has far more agency than Tommy. Tommy actually usually gets kidnapped and tied to a chair or something like that. But I think that's probably the most. But again, Tommy and Tuppence aren't household names. I know Miss Marple is.
Yes, and then there's Modesty Blaise, which is sort of going more in the thriller territory. But Modesty Blaise, I think, obviously is a pop culture icon, but I think deserves to be more well known, often compared to Bond. And I feel like in a way that does Modesty a disservice, because that tries to frame her as a female Bond, and she's very much her own character and her own thing. She's a criminal turned spy, but it is very much a kind of gendered genre. And you have writers today like Kate Moss kind of unpicking some of that. But it was certainly something at the heart of A Wild and True Relation that I wanted to ask, well, who else gets to go on the adventure?
Something I know you and I have talked a little bit about in the past, but in relation to this specifically, is to what extent people might consider some of these choices anachronistic for something that's very much a historical novel. Because obviously, Testament includes elements from the Second World War, but this is kind of like the first period piece. So, how conscious were you of people thinking that putting these things in might kind of make them anachronistic?
Well, like, what I really wanted to do, I was conscious of that because I feel like there's a real erasure in how we're taught history that makes the past seem as if it's always conformed to actually quite a modern, homogenous status quo. When really I feel like the past is far more heterogeneous and disorderly than that, and rebellious than that. So I've always wanted to try and take those stories that have been marginalized and pull them into the center, because they were there and they weren't always even in the margins in their own time. So I kind of want to change a little bit, if I can, how people perceive history. And so certainly with a character like Nathan, who is part of Tom's crew, he's the ship's carpenter, and he is very close with Molly as she's growing up. And he's hiding his sexuality, but Molly kind of works it out, and Tom knows. A lot of the ways that I was able to kind of research the almost kind of what was at stake for Nathan if he was found out was actually through court records, and reading records of trials. And I think that reading those records was actually very heartbreaking. But I feel like for me, almost a mission of my writing is to try and shine a light on those things, and to shine a light on the everyday lives and loves of people outside of that kind of conforming status quo, and to say actually history's a lot more interesting than you might think it is.
You dare to give queer people happy endings,
Yes,
which
yes.
is still alarmingly rare
Yes, it
in a
is.
lot of mainstream or even less mainstream fiction. And
Mm,
what you say there about court records, as you know, I have to read a lot of queer history stuff for
mm,
articles I write, including James Bond. And there's some, in fact, I've got it here. There's a really, really good book that I've used for a few articles over the years called Queer London. And Matt Holbrook, the academic who wrote that, he points this out. It's in quite a lot of the queer history books as well. That we only really can piece together queer history from when the legal system get involved and
mhm,
people are punished, and so that inevitably ends up skewing what we
mm,
know of queer history and
mm,
thinking, oh, it was all miserable and people were getting hanged until the early 1800s for being accused of homosexual acts and
mm,
all of the rest. But actually, there is also a growing body of evidence now about people living quite happy lives as well.
mm.
I mean, there's quite a lot of literature now about queer people who, even though same-sex marriage has only been around for about two decades, people have been getting married informally for hundreds of years. And
Absolutely.
um,
And that was the case on ships, that you could have a kind of unofficial, and often there were sort of unofficial same-sex marriages on
yeah,
ships. And that ships were in some ways an alternate society that you could
yes.
join, particularly if you weren't in the Navy. The Navy had its own strictures, but people were obviously subverting a lot of the time, but particularly on something like a smuggler's ship where you are creating your own kingdom. And that was something I was interested in investigating, because we've got characters like Nathan, characters like Kingston, who has escaped enslavement. You've got people on that ship who are attempting to find freedom,
Mm.
but they can only really achieve it through Tom West's blessing as the captain. So that's part of his contradiction for me as a character, that he's happy to have, in a way, people living lives outside of what would be kind of culturally safe and acceptable elsewhere, but only at his say so. So there's still a certain amount of power going on.
Patriarchal
Yeah,
control.
Exactly. And he is afraid that Nathan will be caught and will be hurt, which comes out of care for Nathan, but also comes out of, I've told you to listen to me and you're not. And his real struggle with power, essentially. And I wanted through Tom West's character to think about that Byronic hero and that archetype, who we celebrate for violence. And that is another form of gender policing. That's another, that's a way in which men are repressed by our norms. And I wanted to kind of get into that with Tom's character.
There is a scene where Tom stands naked in front of another male character, which definitely etched itself on my memory, and makes a kind of comment which isn't anything. It's not even tinged with homophobia, but it's kind of like see anything you like, kind of. That's the kind of vibe from that scene.
Yeah,
and I did get the for all his faults, and he's an endlessly fascinating character. We could do a podcast series just about Tom West characters. If you've not read the book, brace yourself for Tom West in many different ways. Found him very attractive, but also repellent in lots of ways. So he's got very much got that duality. But he has created this, as you said, it's not even a microcosm of society really, because it's almost a utopian society. I think there's definitely something utopian about your ship that sprang to mind when I was describing it to Anthony. And I know he's a much bigger Star Trek fan than I am, but I know you're a huge Star Trek fan as well. So when I was describing to my husband, he was like, "Oh, it sounds a bit like a ship on Star Trek." Where you've got characters who kind of appreciate each other. And for me, I think, again, something that kept me really compelled through the book was the dynamics between this, what we might call even a chosen family or found family, because there's not necessarily that much in the way of blood relation between the characters, but they kind of work as a family. Was that something, again, you were conscious of while you were writing it?
Absolutely. And that was actually went into some of the thinking behind the title. So in the 17th century, women would write stories of their lives, which they would say were for private circulation, but that was a kind of modesty get out of publishing something, just to say, oh, it's only for my family, but really it would be circulated very widely. And they would have these incredibly long titles that acted like blurbs. So it would be like a wild and true relation of my birth, and then my time at court, and then my time going and traveling here and meeting this man. And, so this whole huge long description with a lot of adjectives, a lot of bizarre, strange, wondrous, but always true. They always put the word true in there. So it came from that idea of how women talk about their lives, how we are doubted, the mixture of the wildness, fantastical nature, and what we can claim as true. But it also came from this idea of your relation, who you are related to, who is your family. So for Molly, she's lost her mother very, very young, and Tom is her whole world. He's not her biological father. And that was actually a really contentious sticking point. Early on in the writing of this novel, I was writing it at university. So I was a quite young undergrad age student, and then took it on to my MA. And I remember my tutor and a lot of the students kept insisting he's got to be her biological father, because otherwise there's no reason for him to care about her. And I just really resisted this idea. I was allergic to this idea that there could be no reason for a man to care for a child that wasn't biologically his, and that your family had to be your blood relatives. I hate this idea. And I think a lot of that is personal, because my childhood was very much a found family, really. So I was raised by a single mum, and it was my mum and my sister, and then lots of kids in our neighborhood whose homes weren't safe for various reasons, and so they officially or unofficially joined ours, and I call them my brothers and sisters to this day. And there was this tribe of single mothers who we would call them our supply mummies, who would come and look after us when my mum was working. And when my it was just so important that when I think about family, that's what I think about. I think about those days as a kid when we were just in and out of each other's houses, and all the mums were there. And that was family. And that's why I think community is so important to me, because that's where your family comes from. So for me, it really is very central, both in my life and in the novel, I think.
You probably saw my facial reactions on the podcast. You won't have picked up on that, but I was frowning a lot when you were talking about that people struggled with that, about the not having any kind of biological connection. Because as a queer person, we always, a lot of us talk about chosen family, and actually some of us kind of value chosen family more than necessarily some of the people that we're related to. Genetically, because sometimes queer people get queer people get abandoned by their families entirely, cut off completely, or sometimes actually the relationship is not worth persevering with because it's just actually too painful on both sides. So for me, I think there's so many queer elements of this book, but I think that's one of the most powerful for me, that this book really does validate that idea of chosen family. I mean, I did look into this for an article, kind of like to almost get a sense of validation myself, really, that there is nothing kind of inbuilt in human beings to love people just because you are biologically connected. It's a complete and utter fallacy scientifically. We all have an inbuilt need to nurture, which can manifest in a multitude of different ways, but it doesn't have to be people that you are connected to. And that's quite liberating once you kind of get to that point.
Yeah, very much so.
I hate it. You just made me think of when the most recent Star Wars films were being made, and people were speculating right from the start. So I'm sure I've got a figure of her somewhere. Here she is. There you go. I have all the powerful women of Star Wars lined up on my bookshelf. If you ever wondered what those figures are in the background of these videos, this is them. So this is Rey. And right from Rey's first appearance in Force Awakens, people were going, I wonder who she's related to. And I didn't care. Well, actually, no, I did care. I didn't want her to be related to anybody. And then when it turned out, and I'm going to spoil it because it was released several years ago now, but in the last film of that trilogy, when it was revealed she was a blood relation of a character from the original films, which made no sense whatsoever.
Literally
I
none.
was so frustrated.
Yes.
That I just checked out of the entire movie.
Absolutely.
And I was like, this makes no sense. And it is that really as an unscientific idea that and I know that film played with, she's not going to become her grandfather and all that, but why did it was so much more powerful for her not to have a blood connection with anybody else but essentially it democratized the Force, because it could be anyone. You don't have to be a Skywalker or a Palpatine or whatever. I just got really annoyed.
Absolutely, because it totally makes by making that choice. What they're almost saying is there are royal families in this universe, and if you belong to one of them, you're special, and if you don't, then you're just sort of part of the masses and you don't get a story. And then from a writer's perspective as well, what was so frustrating about that was that it so obviously wasn't the plan from the beginning, and I just found that so maddening. How did they, as somebody who is currently writing 3 books in a big franchise, how did they set about making 3 Star Wars films without a plan? Just boggles my mind. It's like, why didn't somebody say, is there a character arc at any point that we're going to follow? Just
I suppose the saving grace is that it's so kind of obvious when you lay it out like this. She chooses not to go to the dark side. She chooses, she picks the name Skywalker even though she's not related to Skywalkers. So I suppose that is the kind of thing that reprieves it a little bit. But you play with kind of naming conventions in your book as well, don't you? And again, I'm wary that some people, so you might want to fast forward this bit because we're probably going to spoil the ending at this point. But yeah, so again, was that something that, I know you've been writing this book for 14 years, but was that something that you'd always wanted to deal with?
Well, it was a really interesting challenge having Molly have her first few years as Molly and as a girl being raised by her mother, but a girl who does sort of not, I guess, embrace the idea of being a girl. From birth, she is sometimes taken for a boy. She is wanting to have adventures. She loves Tom's stories of going to sea. So from birth, there's this idea of what life could I pursue if I didn't have the restrictions that a woman has in my time. But then she's taken by Tom, and she goes under Orlando. And so there was the question of, well, what name is it going to be? Am I going to change her pronouns? That was something I thought about a lot.
I am listening. I'm just trying to find a particular book, which I think you'll probably appreciate.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm trying to find if it's on the shelf here somewhere. It's definitely on here somewhere.
That's a nice memory.
Have a guess which one I'm trying to find. You've just mentioned Orlando.
You're trying to find Orlando by any chance?
Trying to find Orlando. Oh, it's mixed in. I can find Mrs. Dalloway, but for some reason, Orlando has gone walkies. I don't know where Orlando's gone.
That's Orlando. Well,
yeah, there you go.
So, yeah, that's
Orlando in a bit. There you
go. That is where the name eventually, where I thought, okay, she's going to go under the name Orlando. And for those who don't know, Orlando is a Virginia Woolf novel. It's actually my favorite Woolf novel, and it's about this character Orlando, who's born as a man in the Elizabethan era, and who changes gender through the centuries and ends up as a modern woman in 1920s London, via being an ambassador in Constantinople and arguments with Alexander Pope and all of those great things. And it's one of my favorite novels because it collapses boundaries. So it collapses boundaries between genders, between time periods, and it shows us how much those lines are constructed rather than natural. So I wanted to kind of bring Woolf into the story. So gave Molly the name Orlando. And as she grows older, without wishing to do too many spoilers, but as she grows older, she kind of has more choice over what name that she goes under, and she chooses both. So that was kind of important to me. I didn't want there to be a moment where she says, I am just Molly, or I am just Orlando, but rather I am me, and I am both of these things. And that she doesn't want to be labeled by other people. She just wants to be herself, whatever that is. And so I wanted to have the freedom of those names in play.
I love Orlando. It's annoying that I can't find it because I've tried to find the exact passage. But if people haven't read Orlando, you have to read Orlando. It's absolutely incredible. Yes. There's this passage where it was actually you saying about pronouns that Virginia Woolf just switches the pronoun. Like in the middle of a paragraph. And from this point on, we're going to use a different pronoun.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to go with it, folks. Bear with,
And when you think about the absolute, just I'll try and not go on the rant, but when you think about how people are being whipped into hysteria currently.
Go on a rant, Kim. Go on a rant. Otherwise, I will.
About what pronouns somebody chooses to use in their life, which is entirely a matter of their identity and their personhood. And what right does anybody have to say, actually, that makes me uncomfortable? And why does it make anybody uncomfortable? If Woolf could be doing it then, if we could, for hundreds and hundreds of years, for all of humanity, I would bet this hasn't been a simple matter. So why people now feel they have any right to say it makes me uncomfortable and therefore you should change how you live? I just makes me very angry.
And it's the language reinforces the binary, which I know you and I are always at risk of going down a grammatical tangent, but don't get me started on pronouns. I love those posts that people put online about I don't agree with using pronouns, and it's just like, you just started that sentence with one, so do you actually know what a pronoun is? Could do with a bit of a grammar lesson here.
Yeah, exactly. Before we get on to lessons in humanity, let's start with the grammar. And it, I went back and forth on it. And there was a long time where I was using she for Molly before she went on the ship, and then he, but then I didn't like it because I felt like almost through that I had boxed her into something, and that then there would have to be a moment or not where she chose to switch back, and I felt like it isn't. For this particular character, it isn't a matter of one or the other. And I didn't want to go for, because of I'm writing this, you know, in a character's mind in the 18th century, I didn't want to go for a gender neutral pronoun. And also because I didn't really feel that that was right for her. So in the end, I thought I'm going to stick with she, and I'm going to try and show through the names and through her sense of relationship with her body, which changes, and changing relationship with her sexuality, and how she relates to others. I'll try and use that to explore the spectrum that she experiences.
Wow. Yeah. I could happily talk all day about these things, as you know. I think the kind of last thing and again, this, I'm not going to read it out because it's a spoiler, massive spoiler. Two, it will make me cry. And I'm not averse to crying on Zoom. Absolutely. You know me, I like a good cry. But the last sentence of the book, I've just reread it and I'm starting to go. Oh, no. I can't. Yeah, okay, I will get through it. Right. And again, this might sound really nerdy from a grammatical point of view, but I know we both have followers who do appreciate this sort of thing. It might be my favorite use of a comma, and a grammatically incorrect use of a comma, perhaps, because it's not an Oxford comma. But it might be my favorite use of a comma in all of literature. I'm not exaggerating. So the last sentence of Wild and True, which again, I'm not going to read aloud. And don't skip ahead if you're currently reading the book. Just hurry up and finish reading it. But that comma just turns everything, and it's the kind of tension that runs through 506 pages. And I didn't even read. I couldn't actually read. I know this is really sad. I couldn't actually read past the comma initially because I was just like, and you know, when your eyes flick ahead when you're reading a book, and you put your hand on the page because you don't want to see, because your eyes will read a little bit ahead and they'll start flicking down. I actually moved my hand across the page so slowly, and I was just like, I actually don't want to read what comes after the comma. I read after the comma and I just burst into tears. So and I'm feeling emotional thinking about it, because that meant a lot to me. It's about, without spoiling anything too much, it's about a lot of the issues we've talked about around kind of your relationships with family figures and all that sort of stuff. And I thought, wow, okay, yeah, that was quite powerful. So was that, I know you've said with your Bond trilogy you've kind of written the end already, is which absolutely no spoilers, please. But was that something, was it that exact sentence, or was it that it was that idea to finish with?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. I think that's one of the nicest things anyone's ever said to me. So thank you very much. And I fight hard for my commas against my copy editor, who wants to often simplify my punctuation. So thank you. But that ending, that came quite so endings are probably the hardest part of a novel, because you've kind of got to stick the landing, and you've been gathering this energy all the way through the book. And I had a sense of where it would end, but I didn't fully know. And it was the same actually with Testament. I didn't fully know. There was going to be a big decision for the character at the end, and I didn't know which way she was going to sort of fall down and how she would almost interpret events for herself and what the impact of that would be on her sense of self. And I wrote the ending actually at Agatha Christie's house. Speaking of Agatha Christie, when I was there they have this lovely writing residency where they let writers live in the attic, basically. It's a National Trust property now. And the public come between 10 and 4, I think it is. And otherwise you have the house and the estate to yourself. And there was it was summer, there was one very long evening where I sat out first of all in the vinery, and then moved myself to the courtyard outside the stables. And I just felt like I was following my hand to the ending. I was following the pen to the ending rather than knowing exactly where it was going. And then when I got there, I then kept writing. I got to that sentence and kept writing. And then I thought, actually, hang on. I'm writing because I don't want to let go. I've already finished. And so then the editing process was, let's take it back to that sentence because that's the ending. And it was a huge sense of release and setting something down that I'd been carrying for a long time, but also a sense of loss, because these characters had been with me and alive and unfixed, unfinished for a long time. And I actually wrote to Hilary Mantel, who was a amazingly generous supporter of mine. After my first novel was published, I wrote to her after I'd finished and said, I just want to tell you I did it. I'm done. I finished the book, and I want to thank you for your impact on it and your encouragement. And she wrote back and told me, I've just finished The Mirror and the Light, which was a slightly larger achievement. But it was very lovely because we talked about that sense both of liberation and elation and loss and grief that comes with an ending.
Yeah.
So thank you. I'm glad that it had that impact.
I'm sure other people will find it just as impactful, whatever their own kind of life circumstances. I think that you've crafted a book which I know is very personal to you, but I always think that the more personal people get, and people have said some nice things to me over the last few years as well. I always think I'm writing this for me, but then I kind of think more personal things tend to connect with people more.
Yes. I think that's really interesting. I think that there's a generosity to vulnerability, and we aren't necessarily writing from a personal place to be generous, and I think often it is about answering that internal question, like I was saying earlier. But if we're prepared through our creativity or whatever it is that one does in one's walk of life, if we're kind of prepared to crack ourselves open a little bit and say, this is me without armor, I think that can invite other people to do the same. And that's what's incredibly precious, and I feel incredibly privileged to have it, about the author-reader relationship. When you put something out in the world and it resonates with people, and you can end up having very personal talks with people who might be perfect strangers in a signing queue at a festival, and then suddenly you have this shared moment. So at Hay Festival the other day in the signing queue, somebody came up and said, I had short hair when I was young, and I can't tell you what this book would have meant to me. I wish it had existed then. I'm glad it exists now. And then we kind of talked about similarities in our childhoods and things. And it's just those kinds of moments which for me is the whole point. It's building relationships. And
so many, like I'm just thinking my friend Natasha in the who I've met through the 007 GB club as well. It means so much to her that you love that you put in Double or Nothing a character who's deaf, because you don't get deaf people as heroes of stories terribly often. And I always think it's not box checking, kind of people, the same sorts of people who use woke as a pejorative term will say, it's a diversity box ticking exercise, whatever. It's actually just representing the way life is and society is.
Exactly. And that's the thing I find sad, really, about people who feel that if there's any representation beyond themselves in a story, it's inauthentic.
Yeah.
Why does the status quo own authenticity? I really want to fight against that idea, because the world isn't like that.
Yeah.
So it's only, stories are immensely powerful, and it's worth thinking about why for so long have they reinforced the status quo, and why are people so scared about widening them out? What do they stand to lose? And I think that's really the stem of it. Why people get uncomfortable, because they feel at risk. So I just hope I can invite people into a world with a bit more in it, and say it's fun in here,